is the progress. But
Yeah.
we'll take it.
Continue to pray. Continue to pray.
Right.
The family seems optimistic anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. Morning. Okay, so let's get started. We're talking about the case where a guy borrows the shul's talis and it gets torn, and he wants to know what his liability is. What is his obligation according to halacha? Um, so there were two questions that we dealt with. The first question was pretty straightforward because we had seen it previously that many times there are poskim who suggest, even though this is a point of argument, there are some poskim who suggest that if I borrow something for a mitzvah purpose, my liability is more limited than when I borrow something for personal use. And there's two reasons for that. Number one, because the lender is getting the benefit of my doing a mitzvah with his property. And number two, it's not considered to be personal benefit. It's considered to be giving back to Hashem, right? So even though I may enjoy doing the mitzvah, it's not considered to be personal benefit, and therefore my liability is more limited. The next issue that we dealt with, which was more complicated, is when I borrow a talis, is it considered a matana al manas lahachzir? Is it considered to be not a borrowed item, but that item is mine for the duration of the period that I'm using it? And we saw an example from lulav that if a person borrows a lulav, then he can make a bracha on it, even for the first day. He says, "Afal gav de potter mitzitzis kivin shitala sheula mikol makom rashai levarich kamo she'anashim mevarchos al mitzvahs haseish azman gram." And the answer is that borrowing a talis, you make a bracha, because even though a talis she'ula, a borrowed talis, is patur from tzitzis, you can still make a bracha on it. And this is when you borrow it without the knowledge of the user. And the reason why we said that you can make a bracha on it without the knowledge of the user is because even though you're patur from that mitzvah, you can make a bracha on a mitzvah that you're patur from, just like a woman can make a bracha on a mitzvah that she's patur from, like leishev basukah on sukkahs. But if you borrow it with the consent of the owner, because he puts out a sign and says, here, talesim are here for your use, so then clearly, hare behedja di imshol birshus haba'olim zenechshav ki'ilu nisanolo b'matana. So if you borrow with the consent of the owner, then it's considered as if the owner gave you the object as a gift. And the cost of hataz sham shekain das harash the havi kinasnu lo b'matan al manas lahachzer midu dahava ashol chaluk mechavero v'hodiu shaholech levad ker chavero chola umeis lo meis shirashai likroas habeged ayin sham. This is no different from what the Rush writes. He talks about a case where you borrow a shirt from a friend to go visit the sick with a more dignified garment, and then the guy dies. While you're visiting him, you're supposed to tear kriya, and you're permitted to do so because at that time the garment is yours. So he says, "V'kol shekain b'nidon didan shahatalis sheshoal miyuedes lahash Allah." He says here the shul acquires a set of talitot, okay, that are for the express purpose of lending out. Pashut shadas hagaboyim lahaknos lo es hatalis b'matana al menas lahachzir kedei sheyuchal levarich aleha. And it's clear that the gaboyim of the shul have arranged for the talis to be used by individuals in such a way that they can make a bracha on it. That's the goal of the gaboyim. Leave talitot in the shul. By the way, the word talesim is incorrect grammar. Everyone uses it, but it's talisos, not talesim, because the word talit is a feminine word. So it's talitot. Okay, but it just
It's a feminine word that men wear.
yeah,
But
okay.
it's
Yeah,
just
but
grammar.
a woman can wear a talis also, but not the talis that we're talking about. The word talit is it just means a garment. Like shnaim ochzin betalis, right? It doesn't mean they're holding on to a talis that you get in shul.
Right.
Okay. So anyway, Kadesh yuchal levarich aleh. So the Gaboim want a person to be able to make a bracha, and the proper way to make a bracha is by lending it out such that the person who picks it up owns it during that period while they're borrowing it. Uchvar pasak maran b'shulchan aruch bedin adam shenasan shor lechaver al manas sheyachzirenu lo toch shloshim yom. The Shulchan Aruch discusses the following case: a person gives his friend an ox on the condition that he return it within 30 days. Because it was given as a temporary gift and not just a borrowed item, if the animal dies just purely by natural causes, even though normally if I was a shoel, I would be liable for that, but because the transaction was structured in such a way that it's a temporary gift, I'm going to be patur for paying for that animal's death. Hare dematana almanas lahachzer patur me'onsim. So you see that if it's a temporary gift, the borrower is exempt from onus. Because of hasma shaharashbam beperak yeshnochlen kasav dafilu b'gnei v'vaveda patur de'eno alav ela kishom rechinam. And the Rashbam even goes further to say that you have the status of a shomer chinam who's patur from everything, including theft, except for negligence. V'chein kasav harash b'das Rabbeinu Yeshaya heviu HaMishnah Lamelech b'zel Lashana. And the Rush seems to hold the same way, quoting other Rishonim. Uli inyan hadin imhu matanol manas lahachzer chayiv ba'onsen. As far as whether a person who has acquired a temporary gift is liable for onus, yesh omrim she'enu chayiv ba'onsen sharei b'matana nasnu lo unehinamish lo chsiru lo mikol makom shoel eno. He says, some say that the borrower is completely patur because he's not a traditional borrower. V'chein das hareb Yeshaya zal she'iksha mayish bein matan manas la'achzer l'shaul b'shneim hu shelo ad she'itlenu shneim ein aguf kanui lo. And so Rabbi Yeshaya, the Rosh is quoting him. He's a Tosaphist, and he says, "What's the difference practically between a temporary gift and a borrowed item?" He says both of them are the borrower's temporarily, even though he has to return it and he can't consume it. So v'tirates de matal manas lahachzer enu chayiv ba'onsen de lahachi yohav alei b'matana. And he says quite simply that when you're a borrower, a regular borrower, you're liable for onus. Mihu ki isei be'enei michayiv lahadure le v'keven denu chayiv ba'onsen karina be'lachem. He says it's not considered to be it's considered to be completely the borrower's during the time that he's in possession of it. He's not going to be liable for onsin, and it's called his. A shoel who's liable for ones, it's not considered to be his during that time. And therefore, not only will he be patur from ones, but he'll also be patur from geneva va'aveda for theft and for loss. Ulefize, kevin shehu lakach es atalis b'matal manas lahachzer b'nikra ba'oines, hu patur mehatashlumin. And therefore, the conclusion of Rav Sharaga is that when you borrow a talis from the shul, since they want it to be a matana al manas lahachzer, a temporary gift and not just a borrowed talis, you're going to be patur from all expenses if an onus occurs to this thing and it gets lost, it gets torn, and so forth. Now, let me just see.
And that's because of
the talus has been given to you for the purpose of donning it
for not only donning it,
saying
but
bracha.
also to say the bracha on it.
Because
They-
it's completely different from if you borrow something or if you borrow something from somebody that onus is on you to return it in the same manner you got it.
Correct.
But
Well, that's-
in this
I mean-
case, they're saying it's not.
In this case, the onus is still on the person who took it to return it, provided that, he still has an obligation to return it unless some onus happens to it, unless some mishap happens to it. Because and that's the reason why, that's the substantive difference outside of the issue of a mitzvah article. But the substantive difference between lending something to someone and giving them a temporary gift is what is their level of liability. That's the bottom line. And because Rav Sharaga says, because the Gaboim want people to make a bracha on the talis, the custodians of the shul specifically want people to be able to feel comfortable making a bracha on a talis so that it's temporary. And so therefore they structure it in such a way that whoever takes the talisim off of the rack become the temporary owners. They go hand in hand, and they will have a reduced level of liability for any accidents that happen with the talis.
So does that mean that when you're gonna leave the Gemara and you put on the talis, you think about?
Well, that's a question that is a separate question, and I alluded to it yesterday. I mentioned briefly that my Rebbe held that whenever you're taking a talis, even the shul's talis, if the function of the talis is kavod hatzibor, is just to don it temporarily to honor the congregation, that's another reason why you would be putter from making a bracha on it. And that could be true even if it's your own talis. Well, in other words, let's say the shul is short of talisim, but they want you to put on a talis, and only the most convenient talis you can find is your own. If it's just to be able to wear it so that you can get your aliyah, there's some poskim who would hold that you'd be putter from making a bracha. Now,
So Rabbi, just taking this a step further. So if you lend somebody your book on an etrog
yes,
and they damage it,
yes,
it's a temporary loan. They will make
it's a temporary gift.
Sorry,
And you want them
temporary
to make a bracha.
They made rock on it. When it comes back to you, it's broken. I'm not gonna say
The pitum is off.
Hopefully not. But yeah. So now you can't ask them to compensate for that. I mean,
They are putter. You cannot take them to Beis Din, but I think that menschlichkeit would demand that they
make some amends.
they make amends. Now, what if they say it's the first day of Sukkot? You've already benched Lulav and Esrog.
Right.
You've already davened. This Shmendrik is coming to the 8:30 minyan. You're a serious guy. You come to the 6:45 minyan religiously every morning. You paid because you're like a serious guy. And then this Shmendrik comes to the 8:30 minyan. Not that the 8:30 minyan is nothing wrong with it, right? But this guy, he just wanders in like 8:45 and he says, oh man, I forgot. I didn't pick up my Lulav and Esrog this year. I was planning to. And then he says, do you mind lending it to me? And you say, sure, no problem. And the Shmendrik, right, drops the Esrog accidentally, breaks the pitum, and he says, oops, yeah. It must be because of that wild party we had last night. We didn't finish until, yeah. So then, I'm really sorry, dude. And here's your stuff back. And you say, wait a minute, the pitum's broken. Oh yeah, but you know what? It's still kosher for the subsequent days. You already made your bracha on the first day. You're allowed to make a bracha on a pitumless esrog on the subsequent days of Sukkot. So what's the big deal? What's the big
What if
deal?
you had family members who you can have let them use?
Uh,
We're saying no.
So we're saying not. So he might feel he might feel that, it's no big deal. What?
That he's justified.
Oh, he's,
No, not that he's justified.
He's exempt.
Yeah, listen, it was a matana al manas lahachzir, and we're all brothers, so brothers do that sometimes, they break their brother's stuff, and you can still use it for the other 7 days of Sukkot. So what's the big deal, man? And so he may feel that, okay. Now, it certainly doesn't make you feel good, but technically he can say, I'm putter. Now, let's just read this one quick footnote. He says, "Va'afal gav daharash shamsiyim shenira lo shu chayiv ba'onsim va'filu batanam b'meisa machamas malacha." He says, let's be clear. What Rav Sharaga has done is quoted only a portion of the Rush, where he quotes this Tosafist Rabbeinu Yeshaya, okay, who says that a matanal manas lahachzer is going to be pater from ones. It's going to be pater from even geneva va'aveda. The Rush holds just the opposite, that a matanal manas lahachzer has an even higher liability than a shoah. As he writes, he says, "Unihu nirali dechayev afilu ba'onsin, va'od afilu mesa machmas malacha chayev." He says, I hold personally, says the Rush, that you have a higher liability than a shoal. There's one thing that a shoal is putter from. If the animal dies in the course of work, and I haven't overworked it, I've subjected it to the normal labor that it would be doing in the course of whether it was by you or by me or by anybody else, and it just drops dead, so then I'm putter as a shoal. If it gets struck by lightning, a shoal is liable. But if the animal dies machmas malacha through the natural course of its work, then even a shoal is putter. So the Rush says this guy who got this matana al manas lahachzer has a higher liability than a regular shoal. Shahari kibul alav lahachziro v'im lo hichziru hamatana b'tela. He says because the whole function, the whole mechanism of a matana manas lahachzir is, I give this to you temporarily on the condition that I get it back in the way that I gave it to you. If you give it back to me any differently from the way that I gave it to you, then the terms of the gift have been voided. And as such, it was never in your hands legally to begin with. It's like stolen property. And so therefore the Rush says, you have a higher liability. Mikol makom. Nonetheless, Kevin Shah Shulchan Aruch Pasuk Shapaterman Onsin Kemo Shehevi Rabbeinu Hagon HaMachaber Shlita La'el Hachi Kaimulan. So it's a machlokas rishonim, and the Shulchan Aruch paskins to the lenient side like Rabbeinu Yeshaya and not like the Rush. He says Ella Diyesh La'ayin Bazemi Masha Kasav Marin B'Shulchan Aruch B'Zel Lashana. But there seems to be something contradictory. We have the halacha in Hilchos Lulav as follows. Nasnu lo es halulav al manas lahachziro, hareze yotze bo yedei chova so umachziro, shematana al manas lahachzir shma matana. He says, the Shulchan Aruch writes as follows. If I give my friend my lulav as a gift on the condition that he return it, he can fulfill his mitzvah as long as it's in his hands, because it's considered to be his during that period. Vim lo hechziro, lo yatsa afilu nasan lo esdamav. He says, and if the guy the borrower fails to return the lulav, then retroactively he never fulfilled the mitzvah, because he voided the terms of the gift. And therefore, va'afilu nenas miyado, and that's true even if an onus occurred, and it got swept away in a torrential storm. Or if he returns it after the time that the mitzvah can be done with it, that's also considered to be voiding the terms of the gift. And there, the Shulchan Aruch is going according to the Rush, not going according to Rabbeinu Yeshaya. Ulufum riyata mashma midivrei Maran hanal, shematana al manas lahachzer chayiv ba'onsin, v'lachenim alulav nenas miyado lo yatsa yedei chova. It sounds like from that section of Shulchan Aruch, not in contrast with what he writes in Choshen Mishpat, that if a person receives a matan al manas lahachzer, then he is liable for onsin. The kasha, the Choshen Mishpat pasak marin shematan al manas lahachzer pater meonsin. So this seems to be a direct contradiction between what the Mechaber writes in Choshen Mishpat versus what the Mechaber writes in Orach Chaim. And so how do you reconcile the two? On the one hand, in Choshen Mishpat, he writes that if a person receives a matan manas lahachzer, he's pater from onsin. And when it comes to Hilchos Lulav, he's voided the gift and is liable for onsin if he never ends up returning it. Shuv ra'isi shekvar higish bazeh ha-Mishnah Berurah sham because of his Elishana. The Mishnah Berurah is disturbed by this as well. And he writes, he says, even though the Mechaber in Choshen Mishpat holds that if by a matan manas lahachzer the borrower is pater from onsin, hainu mishum de'eno lav din shomer shaharei b'toras matana ba'aliyado. That's because of the laws of shmira. When I receive a temporary gift, I am no longer considered to be a shomer, a guardian in the conventional sense, and therefore I'm pater from onus. Avol al kol panim hatanai lo nitkayem ve'eno elo kipikadon biyado ulahachi lo yatsa b'inyanenu ad kan l'shono. But nonetheless, by not returning it, the condition of the gift was not fulfilled, and it's therefore considered to be something that he never acquired as a gift, and therefore he's not yotzei the mitzvah. So the Mishnah Berurah basically says, on a financial level, you cannot hold him liable, but on a mitzvah level, he never fulfilled the mitzvah. That's the distinction that the Mishnah Berurah draws. So if I end up not returning the matan al manas lahachzir, it was never mine retroactively. But what's my level of liability? I'm not a shoel. I'm just a guy who had someone else's property in his possession, but I was not vested with that liability of onsin. That's how the Mishnah Berurah sees the distinction. V'chein kosav hakaf hachayim sham, amnam adayin tzarich bir, but it's still not, the Kaf HaChaim writes the same thing, but the problem is not completely solved. He says, because if a guy borrows a lulav and it's a matan manas lahachzer, and he never ends up giving it back intact, so that means he's voided the gift and it was never his. Why then isn't he liable for ones? Because he had something in his possession that wasn't his, and de facto he becomes a shoel. You therefore have to say, the cheshahanote natan matan manas lahachzir kavanato the imyikayim hatanai v'yachziro az havi matana gemura v'hamakabel nechshav ba'olim gemurim kol zman shamatana birshusa. You have to say that it all depends on the thought process of the owner of the item. The thought process seems to go something like this. If you return the item to me after you finish using the item, then it was considered to be yours during the duration of your possession of it. V'im lo yachziro me'iza tam sheyiyeh, az dino yeh kishomer shepater me'onsa. And if you end up not returning it to me, then it was never yours, but you don't have the liability of a shoel. You just are holding my property without any level without it taking responsibility. And if you look at it that way, then it'll work out to reconcile the apparent contradiction. So if the guy returns the lulav, he's fulfilled the mitzvah with a lulav that was technically his during the time when he was shaking it, vimnenas miyado as lokim es mitzvah kevin sheizbar shu rak shomer al halulav v'lo ba'olam gemura. And if he doesn't return the lulav intact, then he retroactively never owns the lulav. But he's just a shomer without the standard liability. Okay. He says, I'm gonna give you another answer in the next footnote, but that seems to be the standard approach. And it's basically nishtahin nishtaher kind of situation where you're sort of caught in limbo. You're not a standard shomer if you never return the item, but it was never yours and it was really someone else's item in your possession. But just that you didn't accept the standard liability that a person normally would accept.
So what happens if somebody doesn't want to give it back and he's forced to based in or whatever? Does he still get the next one?
Well, I guess as long as there's still time for the owner to still fulfill the mitzvah, like if the guy has to wait a week before he gets it back and he couldn't do the mitzvah all subsequent days, then then he hasn't fulfilled, and he will retroactively, he never fulfilled the mitzvah. Because the terms of the loan were, I'm letting you use it while you're davening on the condition that I get it back sometime later this morning. Right? That's implicit when I lend you my lulav. If you're going to say, well, I decided to hold on to it for the rest of Yantif, what do you mean? I never gave it to you so that you would deprive me of the opportunity to use it for the rest of Yantif. That doesn't seem right.
Like a stolen item.
Yeah. Well, it's right. It's basically a stolen property, but I'm not liable financially. But I never retroactively, I never fulfilled the mitzvah. So the guy's got to be a real bozo. I don't know why he would do that. Okay. So he says, Ulam b'shailos t'shuvas. Then we go back to Rav Shiraga's text. Ulam b'shailos t'shuvas sharei deya. Kasav da'afal gavdi yesh umdan alomar demistama nasamo b'mantal manas lahachzer k'dei sheyetze bo yedei chovaso. So this sefer, it's by a Rabbi Litvin. I don't know who this is. He writes that even though we assume that it was a temporary gift to enable you to fulfill the mitzvah, b'mikra shekara lo onas yesh umdan das hafuch shal das zel onasno lo shia potter v'asi umdana umevatal umdana ayin shab. He says, but there's also an equal assumption, or let's say an assessment of the thought process of the lender. I want you to fulfill the mitzvah with it, but I also want you to be liable and be responsible for it. So that I only want you to own it, provided that I get it back intact without any excuses. If so, va'asi umdana umevatul umdana, and therefore one assessment negates the other assessment. And therefore, his psak is that you can make if you borrow a lulav, you can make a bracha on it because we assume the owner wants you to own it for that temporary period. But at the same time, we also assume that the owner wants you to assume full liability for that item that you're borrowing, and therefore you are going to be chayiv and onsin. And so in this footnote, the Makor Baruch. Oh, so let's just finish it, and then maybe because we just have a minute left. Mikol makom lahalacha nira shahamuchzak yomer kimli shapater kevin shadas marin shamatal manaslat zerpater miyonsa. But the borrower, even though there's that shuva that says he is liable for onus, the borrower can say, I paskin like the Shulchan Aruch that I'm pater from onus. Va'od dekevin shushol l'dvar mitzvah yacholomer kimli kaposkim shashol l'dvar mitzvah pater miyonsa. And finally, he can say that, well, I borrowed it for the sake of a mitzvah. And anytime you borrow something for the sake of a mitzvah, there are poskim who say that you're always pater from onus, and therefore leave me alone. Hakmir nishta chinik, and I'm not going to pay for the torn talis. I'm not going to pay for the broken pitum. You're out of luck, buddy. So a guy could say that he would be legally within his rights to make that kind of claim, and you'll just have to grin and bear it, or daven in a different minyan from now on. What?
Or not lend them your lulav.
Not lend them your lulav. You'll lesson learned. Look, any person who's going to act that I would say that's acting in bad faith. You should at least feel bad that while it was in your possession. But it is important to know that, let's say you're dealing with two Erlich Yidden, two really good guys, and they want to do the right thing. It's good to know what my level of obligation is, and if I want to make the guy whole, what I can do to go above and beyond the letter of the law, because I feel bad that I broke I tore his talis, tore the shul's talis. I would think that anyone who tears the shul's talis would say, this is hektish. This is the sanctified property of the community. Okay, so maybe technically I'm off the hook because the shul gave it to me as a matana manas lahachzir. But I want to do the right thing. But let's say, on the other hand, the lender is an Erlich Yid, and he says, no, I don't want to take money from you because maybe you're putter, and I don't want to take money from you if you think that you're obligated to me. You're totally not obligated to me, according to some poskim. According to other poskim, you are obligated, but I'm not. So a lot of times, you have that kind of righteous exchange between two people, and that's also a very nice thing. So have a wonderful Shabbos, everyone. We still have this footnote to do, hey, which I think is going to be hopefully satisfying. And just have a beautiful Shabbos, and let's hear good news from Eretz Yisrael.